There is something deeply strange about watching old Bewitched reruns now, knowing what we know. You see Elizabeth Montgomery and Dick York together on screen, laughing, bickering, doing that whole magical married couple thing, and it all looks so easy and natural. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling, those two people apparently had almost nothing to say to each other. And by the end, they had nothing to say.
I got a call from Bill Asher, who was the producer of Bewitched, and it was the husband of Elizabeth Montgomery. And he said, "Would you come meet me?" I said, "Sure." So I went over. He said, I'm producing and directing some of the shows, but I'm not going to produce it anymore. I'd like you to produce it." I said, "Really?" He said, "Sure, come on over. The seat is yours."
Honey, you and your mother ever keep a family album?
No, why?
I was just wondering. Someday Tabitha's going to grow old and gray, and she just might want to tell her great-great-grandchildren about her Uncle Arthur.
Dick York vanished from the show in 1969, and Elizabeth Montgomery never brought up his name again. Not in a single interview. Not when he passed away in 1992. Not once. And for a woman who had shared 5 years of her professional life with someone who had filmed hundreds of episodes alongside him, that level of silence is not normal. It is deliberate. And the real story behind it is a lot more complicated, more layered, and honestly more human than the dramatic version people have been circulating for years. To understand what went wrong between them, you first have to understand what went right, because what they had on screen genuinely was something special.
A full-page ad for an individual restaurant. Whoever took that out must be nuts.
How do you say that?
Do you know how much a full-page ad costs?
No, how much?
It costs.
When Bewitched premiered on ABC in September 1964, it became an immediate hit. The concept was charming. A powerful witch named Samantha chooses to marry an ordinary mortal man named Darren and tries to live a normal suburban life. But the reason audiences fell completely in love with it was not the premise. It was those two people. Elizabeth Montgomery was already Hollywood royalty before Bewitched. She was the daughter of film legend Robert Montgomery, had been working in television since 1951, and had already been married twice before the show even started. She was sophisticated, impossibly beautiful, and had this quality on screen that made you feel like you were watching someone slightly better than the rest of the world. But in a way, you didn't resent. She was her father's daughter in the best sense, though she spent most of her career trying to step out from under that shadow. Dick York came from a completely different world. He grew up in a working-class family in Indiana. His father was a salesman, his mother was a seamstress, and he got into acting not because of connections or money, but because a Catholic nun noticed his voice when he was a child and encouraged him. He started in radio at 15, moved to New York, did Broadway, did live television, and slowly built himself up through sheer talent. By the time he walked into the Bewitched audition, he was a genuinely respected character actor who had held his own alongside Spencer Tracy and Frederick March in Inherit the Wind, and gone toe-to-toe with Ernie Kovacs on set in ways that even impressed Kovacs, which was not easy to do. When he first walked into the room to read for Darren Stevens and saw Elizabeth Montgomery sitting there, York later described the moment in a way that tells you everything you need to know about how he felt about her from the start. He talked about how she looked, how she held herself, and he was immediately captivated. That feeling, from his side at least, never really went away. Their chemistry in those early seasons was completely genuine. Co-stars and crew members from the period all say the same thing. They clicked immediately, there was a natural ease between them, they made each other laugh, and that energy translated directly onto the screen. The show was beloved, consistently at the top of the ratings, and a lot of that was down to how real they seemed together. But here is the thing about real chemistry. It does not always mean both people feel the same things.
I first fell in love with Elizabeth Montgomery by leg distance. No, that's not a typographical error. It's not long distance. By leg distance.
Here is the part of this story that gets overlooked because everyone focuses on the dramatic end of York's time on the show. And that is the fact that Dick York was already in serious physical trouble before Bewitched even began filming. In 1959, 5 years before the show, York was working on a film called They Came to Cordura, alongside Gary Cooper and Rita Hayworth. During a physically demanding scene involving a handcar on a rail line, a crew member lost their grip on the handle, and it snapped back with full force, straight into York's spine. The injury was immediate and severe, a torn muscle along his spine that caused him pain for the rest of his life. He described the sensation in interviews as feeling like an explosion inside his back, and that is not an exaggeration. The damage was real, permanent, and progressive. At the time, York did what actors of that era were expected to do. He gritted through it, took painkillers to manage the worst days, kept working, and never made it anyone else's problem if he could avoid it. By the time he was cast in Bewitched, he had been managing this injury for years and had developed a way of appearing fine even when he was far from it. But television is relentless. Bewitched filmed season after season with a demanding schedule, and the physical toll of standing, moving, reacting, and performing day after day started to compound the damage that had already been done. The painkillers that had been keeping him functional started to lose their effect. He needed more of them to achieve the same result, and more medication meant foggier thinking, slower reactions, and increasingly unpredictable behavior on set. What happened next followed a pattern that is depressingly familiar when it comes to chronic pain and prescription medication in that era. York started supplementing his pills with alcohol to manage the edges of what the medication couldn't reach. By the later seasons, there were days when crew members weren't sure which version of Dick York was going to show up, and there were other days when he couldn't show up at all. One detail that rarely gets included in the sanitized version of this story is something that happened during Season 3. York refused to use a stunt double for a scene that required him to appear sitting in an invisible chair. The effect was done using a curved metal plate suspended by piano wire. When producer William Asher offered him the double, he did it in a way that made it very clear he considered York asking for help a sign of weakness. York, feeling challenged, insisted on doing it himself. During the second take, one of the wires snapped. York later recalled that Asher's attitude on set, this constant low-level pressure to perform regardless of physical condition, made an already difficult situation significantly worse. And given that Asher was both York's boss and Elizabeth Montgomery's husband, there was very little York could do about it. Now, we get to the part of this story that makes the whole thing considerably more complicated and considerably more sad. Dick York, by multiple accounts, developed genuine feelings for Elizabeth Montgomery. Not just admiration for a talented co-star, but something more personal, more attached. The specifics of exactly how deep those feelings went have never been fully confirmed, but the people who were close to both of them during the Bewitched years have said consistently that York's feelings went beyond what Montgomery was comfortable with or willing to reciprocate. This matters because it changes the entire dynamic of what was happening on set. Montgomery was a married woman, married to the show's producer, no less. And if her co-star's feelings toward her had crossed a professional line, that would have created an impossible situation for her to navigate every single day. She couldn't exactly switch shows. She was filming scenes with him that were built around intimacy and connection, And doing that while also managing an unwanted emotional attachment from him would have been exhausting in ways that are hard to overstate. There is also the fact that Elizabeth Montgomery was not a woman who handled discomfort gracefully by talking through it. She was described consistently by people who knew her as intensely private, controlled, and not someone who wore her feelings openly or dealt with awkward situations by confronting them directly. When things bothered her, she withdrew. She created distance. She went silent. And that is exactly what she did with York as the years went on. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is that York seems to have genuinely not understood for a long time why the warmth between them had cooled. He kept showing up to work, kept trying to hold everything together, kept performing through pain that most people would have walked away from, and the person he was doing a lot of it for had already, emotionally speaking, moved somewhere he couldn't reach. Meanwhile, Montgomery's marriage to William Asher was developing its own serious cracks. Later in the show's run, she began an affair with director Richard Michaels, who joined the production in its later seasons. The affair was not a secret on set for very long, and by 1972, when Bewitched aired its final episode, Michaels's marriage had ended. Montgomery and Asher divorced in 1973. So while York was struggling with his health and his feelings and his professional survival, the personal landscape around him on that set was considerably more turbulent than it might have appeared from the outside.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Montgomery, with a word to mothers about 2 new cereals from Quaker.
And they are absolutely extraordinary people. And if they're watching, hi.
Cast was extraordinary. I mean, my gosh, what a cast we had. I mean, really super, super people. Morris Evans, Agnes Moorehead, golly, Marion Lorne, Paul Lind. And I was never bored on the set. Not 1 minute for 8 years was I bored.
By season 5, Dick York was not functioning the way a lead actor in a network television show needed to function. The missed days had accumulated. The rewrites to accommodate his physical limitations had accumulated. The patience of the production team, such as it was, had worn down, and Elizabeth Montgomery, who had apparently been tolerating the situation rather than genuinely accepting it for some time, had reached a point where she was done. The moment that ended his time on the show came in 1969. York was on set, filming what should have been a routine scene in the kitchen when his body simply gave out. He went pale, started swaying, and collapsed in front of the entire cast and crew. He was rushed to the hospital, and unlike every other time he had been unwell and found his way back to the set, this time the production did not wait for him to recover. The official explanation given to the public was health-related, which was true but vague. What was happening behind the scenes was that the decision had already been made, or was being made extremely quickly, that York would not be returning. Dick Sargent, who had actually been the first choice for the role of Darren back when the show was being cast in 1964, was brought in as a replacement. The transition happened with no on-screen acknowledgement, no farewell episode, and nothing resembling a graceful exit for someone who had spent 5 years building the character. York later said he tried to reach out to be told officially what was happening, that he hoped for some indication that his years of service had mattered, and that he never received meaningful communication from the production. He also sent a letter, possibly more than one, to Elizabeth Montgomery after his departure. She never wrote back. Whether the decision not to respond was hers alone or was influenced by her husband, and the production is something that has never been fully established. But the result was the same either way. Total silence. He spent the years after Bewitched in circumstances that make for genuinely difficult reading. The back injury continued to worsen. The addiction to painkillers, which had developed out of medical necessity but had grown beyond it, was something he had to work through without much support. He and his wife Joan, whom he had married back in 1952 and who remained his anchor through everything, went through periods of serious financial hardship. There were stretches where they were close to poverty. He essentially had to rebuild himself without the industry he had given his career to, and he did it largely out of the public eye, in Michigan, far from Hollywood. What he chose to do with that time, though, says a lot about who Dick York actually was. Despite being largely confined to his bed during significant parts of the 1980s and early 1990s, he established a charity organization called Acting for Life, which was dedicated to helping homeless people. He made phone calls, coordinated donations, and used what was left of his voice and his name to actually do something for people who needed it. Friends who visited him during those years described a man who was still warm, still sharp, still genuinely interested in other people, even when his body was failing him badly. He spoke about Elizabeth Montgomery in interviews during this period with a kind of careful dignity that must have taken real effort. He never publicly attacked her, never accused her of anything, never tried to use their estrangement for any kind of leverage or attention. He referred to her as a lovely woman and said he hoped she thought of him fondly. Given everything that had happened, that restraint was nothing. When York passed away on February 20th, 1992, from complications related to emphysema, he was 63 years old and had been living in relative obscurity for years. The entertainment press covered his death. Fans of the show mourned him, and people who remembered what he had built during those first 5 seasons of Bewitched spoke about him with real warmth. Elizabeth Montgomery said nothing. She had spoken publicly about other members of the Bewitched cast who had died. She gave tributes. She made statements. Dick York got silence, the same silence he had received from her since 1969. The same silence that had answered his letters. The same silence that had been her only response to 23 years of estrangement. Hollywood has always been better at manufacturing love stories than actually living them. Dick York and Elizabeth Montgomery gave audiences one of the most convincing marriages ever put on screen. And behind it was a silence that neither of them ever broke. If stories like this are your thing, subscribe, because there are plenty more where that came from.